The rental car's engine ticked as it cooled in the desert heat, the only sound breaking the vast silence that stretched across the New Mexico landscape. Sarah Martinez stepped out onto the cracked asphalt, her designer heels immediately sinking into the red dirt that had blown across the remote gas station's parking lot. The contrast couldn't have been sharper. 3 days ago, she'd been drowning in the cacophony of Manhattan traffic, her phone buzzing with endless demands from the marketing firm where she'd spent the last 8 years climbing a ladder that seemed to lead nowhere. The panic attacks had started small, a tightness in her chest during morning meetings, a racing heart when her phone rang. But they'd grown, like storms gathering strength, until she found herself hyperventilating in the office bathroom, clutching the cold tile walls while the city's relentless noise pressed against the windows like a living thing. "I need space," she'd told her sister Eleanor during their last video call. "Real space, not just a weekend in the Hamptons. I need to remember what quiet sounds like." Elena had laughed, but not unkindly. "You, Miss, I need 3 coffee shops within walking distance. Sarah, you've never been anywhere quieter than Central Park." But Elena had also been the one to suggest New Mexico. Their grandmother's stories had always painted pictures of wide skies and ancient landscapes, of a cousin who'd married a park ranger and lived near some reservation land outside Santa Fe. "Go see Maria," Elena had said. "She's got that little guest house. Maybe she'll remember what Abuela used to say about the desert healing broken hearts." Now, standing beside Route 285 with nothing but sagebrush and red mesas stretching to the horizon, Sarah wondered if she'd made a terrible mistake. The silence was so complete, it felt alive, pressing against her eardrums like cotton. In the distance, heat waves danced over the asphalt, creating mirages that shimmered and disappeared. She pulled out her phone, 1 bar of signal if she was lucky. The GPS had stopped working 20 miles back, leaving her with handwritten directions on a napkin and a growing sense that she'd driven off the edge of the known world. The gas station was barely more than a shack with 2 ancient pumps and windows so sun-bleached she couldn't see inside. A handwritten sign in the window read, "Cold drinks, maps, jerky." Sarah pushed open the screen door, its hinges groaning in protest. The man behind the counter looked up from a worn paperback, his weathered face creasing into a smile. "You look lost, miss." "I'm looking for the Delgado place," Sarah said, smoothing down her blouse, suddenly aware of how out of place she must look. "My cousin Maria. She lives near the San Carlos Apache reservation." "Ah, Maria with the pottery business." The man nodded. "You're closer than you think. About 15 miles north, then take the dirt road at the old windmill. Can't miss it. Only windmill for 50 miles. He studied her expensive clothes, her impractical shoes. "First time out here? Is it that obvious?" City folks have a particular look when they first see all this nothing," he said with gentle humor, "like they're waiting for something to happen. But that's the point of the desert, isn't it? Teaching you to be comfortable with the nothing." Sarah bought a bottle of water and a map, though the man assured her she wouldn't need it. "Desert's got its own navigation system," he said. "You just got to learn to listen." Back in the car, Sarah followed the ribbon of asphalt north, watching the landscape shift and breathe around her. Mountains rose like sleeping giants in the distance, their peaks sharp against a sky so blue it hurt to look at directly. The silence was becoming less oppressive and more present, like a living thing that had been waiting patiently for her to notice it. When she finally spotted the windmill, a skeletal metal structure turning lazily in the hot breeze, relief flooded through her. The dirt road beyond was barely 2 tire tracks cutting through the desert scrub, but it led to a small adobe house with a red tile roof and a garden that somehow thrived in the arid landscape. Maria Delgado came out to greet her before Sarah had even turned off the engine. She was smaller than Sarah remembered from childhood visits, her black hair now streaked with silver, but her embrace was warm and fierce. "Mija, you look terrible," Maria said, with the bluntness that Sarah remembered running in the family. "When Elena called and said you were having a crisis, I thought she was being dramatic. But look at you. thin as a rail and jumpy as a cat. "It's good to see you too, Prima," Sarah managed, surprised to feel tears pricking her eyes. "Come on, let's get you inside. The desert sun isn't kind to city skin." Ide. The guest house was a small casita connected to the main house by a covered walkway lined with pottery that Maria made and sold to galleries in Santa Fe. The little room was cool and spare, with thick adobe walls, vigas across the ceiling, and a window that looked out toward the mountains. "You can stay as long as you need," Maria said, setting fresh towels on the simple wooden dresser. "But fair warning, it gets quiet out here, real quiet. Some people can't handle it." "That's what I'm hoping for," Sarah said, sinking onto the bed. "I need to remember how to think without noise." "The desert's good for that," Maria agreed. "But it shows you things about yourself you might not be ready to see. You sure you're prepared for that kind of quiet?" As if in answer, the wind picked up outside, rattling the old window and carrying with it the scent of sage and something deeper, something that spoke of ancient stories and patient stones. For the first time in months, Sarah felt her shoulders relax. "I guess I'll find out," she said. That night, lying in the unfamiliar bed with no sounds of traffic or sirens or late-night conversations from neighboring apartments, Sarah stared at the ceiling and listened to her own heartbeat. Outside, the desert settled into its nocturnal rhythm, the distant call of a coyote, the rustle of small creatures moving through the scrub, the whisper of wind through the arroyos. She'd come here to escape the noise, but now she wondered if she'd been running from something else entirely. In the vast quiet of the high desert, there was nowhere left to hide from the question that had been chasing her through every sleepless night in the city. What if the life she'd built wasn't actually hers at all? Sarah woke before dawn to a sound she'd never heard before. Absolute silence. Not the muffled quiet of a Manhattan apartment with good soundproofing, but a silence so pure it seemed to ring in her ears. Through the small window, the desert was painted in shades of silver and shadow, waiting for the sun to bring it to life. She dressed in the most practical clothes she'd packed, jeans and hiking boots Elena had insisted she buy, and stepped outside. The air was cool and thin, carrying the green scent of sage and something else, something mineral and ancient that seemed to rise from the earth itself. "You're up early for a city girl," Maria called from the main house, where she was already at work in her pottery studio, her hands shaping clay on the wheel. "I couldn't sleep," Sarah admitted, wrapping her arms around herself as the morning breeze cut through her thin sweater. "The quiet takes getting used to," Maria said, not looking up from her work. "But once you do, you'll never be able to go back to all that noise. Coffee's on the stove. Help yourself." The coffee was strong and bitter, nothing like the carefully crafted lattes Sarah was used to, but it warmed her from the inside as she sat on Maria's front porch, watching the sun creep over the eastern mountains and set the desert ablaze with color. "I thought I'd drive around today," Sarah said when Maria joined her with her own cup. "Get familiar with the area." "Where you planning to go?" "I don't know, just explore, I guess." Maria studied her for a long moment. "You know, there's an old road about 10 miles east of here. Runs along what used to be a trading route between the Pueblos and the Apache settlements. It's mostly abandoned now, but it's peaceful. Good place to think." "Sounds perfect." "But Sarah," Maria's voice carried a gentle warning, "this isn't Central Park. You get lost out here. It's serious business. Take water, tell me where you're going, and be back before dark. The desert doesn't forgive carelessness." An hour later, Sarah found herself driving down a dirt road that seemed to lead nowhere, following Maria's hand-drawn map and landmarks that seemed impossibly far apart. A distinctive rock formation here, a dead cottonwood there. The landscape rolled past in waves of red earth and green scrub, punctuated by mesas that rose like ancient fortresses from the desert floor. The old trading road, when she finally found it, was barely visible. 2 faint tracks worn into the hardpan, overgrown with grass and marked by occasional stone cairns that someone had built to mark the way. Sarah parked where the road began and set off on foot, carrying a water bottle and her phone, though she'd given up on getting any signal miles ago. Walking the ancient path, she began to understand what Maria meant about the desert showing you things about yourself. With every step away from the noise and urgency of her old life, she felt layers of tension peeling away like old paint. The constant knot in her shoulders loosened. The racing thoughts that had kept her awake for months began to slow, then quiet altogether. She'd been walking for maybe an hour when she saw the horse. It stood about 50 yards off the trail, a paint horse with patches of brown and white, its reins hanging loose. As Sarah watched, a man appeared from behind a cluster of rocks, leading a second horse, this one a solid bay with intelligent eyes. The man was tall and lean, with long black hair tied back and skin bronzed by years of desert sun. He wore jeans and a work shirt, nothing exotic or stereotypical, but there was something in the way he moved. A quiet confidence, an economy of motion that spoke of someone completely at home in this harsh landscape. Their eyes met across the distance, and for a moment neither moved. Then the man touched the brim of his hat in a brief acknowledgement and turned back to his horses. Sarah found herself walking in his direction, drawn by a curiosity she couldn't quite name. As she got closer, she could see that he was examining one of the bay's hooves, his movements careful and gentle. "Horse problems," she called out when she was close enough to speak without shouting. He looked up, his dark eyes taking in her clean hiking boots, her city pallor, her obvious foreignness to this place. "Stone bruise, I think," he said simply. His voice was quiet, with a slight accent she couldn't place. "He'll be fine." "I'm Sarah," she said, feeling suddenly foolish for introducing herself to a stranger in the middle of nowhere. "David," he replied, straightening. "David Nez." "Beautiful country out here," Sarah said, immediately cringing at how inadequate the words sounded. "It is," he agreed, but without the tourist-friendly enthusiasm she might have expected. He simply stated it as fact, the way someone might comment on the weather. "I'm staying with my cousin Maria over near the gas station on 285, Sarah found herself explaining. "Just trying to get some perspective, I guess. Clear my head." David nodded, patting his horse's neck. "Good place for that." "You live around here?" "All my life," he said. "My family's got land about 20 miles north. I run cattle, do some outfitting for hunting parties in the fall." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, the desert stretching around them in all directions. Sarah realized this was the first conversation she'd had in weeks that didn't involve deadlines or deliverables or the 1,000 small emergencies that had consumed her life in the city. "I should let you get back to your horse," she said finally. "And I should let you get back to your thinking," David replied, but there was something in his tone, not quite humor, but close to it. As Sarah turned to go, he called after her, "Miss Sarah, if you're planning to walk these old roads much, you might want to carry more water and maybe let someone know where you're going. This country can surprise you." It was practical advice, delivered without condescension. Sarah found herself smiling for the first time in days. "I'll remember that." Walking back to her car, Sarah found her mind quieter than it had been in months. Something about the encounter, the simplicity of it, the lack of agenda or performance, had settled something restless inside her. David Nez hadn't tried to impress her or sell her anything or fix whatever was broken in her life. He'd simply been present, the way the desert itself was present, without explanation or apology. Back at Maria's that evening, Sarah found herself thinking about those quiet, dark eyes, the gentle way he'd handled his injured horse, the economy of his words. She'd met plenty of men in the city who could talk for hours without saying anything real. David had said maybe 20 words, but somehow she felt like she'd learned more about him than she knew about colleagues she'd worked with for years. "You look different," Maria observed over dinner. Simple food, beans and rice and green chilies that made Sarah's eyes water. "More settled." "I met someone today," Sarah said, surprising herself by mentioning it. "On that old trading road you told me about. David Nez said he runs cattle." Maria's eyebrows rose. "David?" "Yeah, I know him. Good man. His family's been on that land since before the reservation boundaries got drawn. He doesn't talk much, but when he does, it's worth listening to. He seemed, Sarah searched for the right word, peaceful, I guess, like he knew exactly who he was and where he belonged. That's the desert for you, Maria said. It strips away everything that doesn't matter, leaves you with what's real. Some people can't handle that much truth, but sounds like maybe you're starting to. That night, Sarah lay in bed listening to the coyotes sing to the moon and thought about belonging. She'd spent years building a life in Manhattan, but had she ever really belonged there? Or had she just gotten good at playing a part, speaking the language, hitting the marks that success required? Out here, with nothing but silence and space and the honest assessment of strangers who owed her nothing, she was beginning to suspect that everything she'd thought she wanted might have been borrowed from someone else's dreams. The question was, what did she actually want? And did she have the courage to find out? 3 weeks into her stay, Sarah had developed a routine that would have horrified her old self. She woke with the sun, helped Maria with the morning chores, then spent her days walking the network of old roads and arroyos that crisscrossed the desert. Her phone stayed silent in her pocket, no signal, no temptation to check email or scroll through the endless anxiety of social media. The city felt like something that had happened to someone else. She'd seen David twice more since that first encounter, once at the feed store in the nearest town, where he'd nodded politely and asked how she was settling in. Once from a distance, moving cattle across a far pasture, too far away to speak, but close enough to recognize his easy seat in the saddle and the patient way he worked with the animals. Sarah found herself thinking about those brief encounters more than she cared to admit. Not in the fevered way she'd obsessed over relationships in the city, analyzing every word, every glance for hidden meaning, but with a quiet curiosity that felt new to her. On a Thursday morning that dawned clear and cool, with autumn beginning to touch the high desert, Sarah set out for a longer walk than usual. Maria had mentioned an old petroglyph site about 5 miles north, accessible by a trail that followed a dry creek bed. "Take plenty of water," Maria warned, "and if you see any clouds building, turn back. Flash floods can come out of nowhere." The trail was fainter than the ones Sarah had grown used to, marked more by the absence of vegetation than by any clear path. She followed the meandering course of the arroyo, stepping carefully on the smooth stones that lined its bed. The silence here was different from the road, deeper somehow, weighted with the presence of ancient stories carved into the rock faces that rose on either side. She'd been walking for maybe 2 hours when she heard the sound of an axe biting wood. Following the sound, Sarah climbed out of the arroyo and found herself on a small flat overlooking a grove of cottonwoods. David was there, working methodically to clear deadfall from around a small spring that bubbled up from the rocks. His shirt was dark with sweat despite the cool morning air, and there was a pile of cut branches stacked neatly to one side. "Maintenance day?" Sarah called out. David looked up, his face registering genuine surprise. "Didn't expect to see anyone out here. You're getting pretty adventurous with these walks." "Maria told me about the petroglyphs," Sarah said, climbing down to join him by the spring. "I thought I'd take a look." "They're worth seeing," David agreed, wiping his forehead with the back of his hand. "But you missed the turnoff. About half a mile back there's a gap in the rock wall on the left. Easy to miss if you don't know what you're looking for. And you're out here because this spring feeds into the creek that runs through our land," David explained. "Drought years. It's the difference between the cattle making it through or not, so we keep it clear, make sure nothing's blocking the flow." Sarah knelt by the spring, cupping the cold water in her hands. It was impossibly clear, bubbling up from some underground source that had been flowing for longer than human memory. "How long has your family been taking care of this place?" "My great-grandfather used to bring his father here when he was a boy," David said, settling onto a flat rock nearby. "Before the reservation, before the boundaries, before any of the complications, just people taking care of water so the water could take care of them. There was something in his voice when he talked about his family, a reverence that Sarah recognized but couldn't quite place. It wasn't nostalgia exactly, more like a living connection to something larger than himself. "That must be nice," she said, meaning it more than the casual words suggested. Having that kind of continuity, knowing where you come from. David studied her face. "You don't have that." "I thought I did," Sarah said, surprised by her own honesty. "But the more time I spend out here, the more I realize I don't actually know much about my own family's stories. We got so busy moving forward, we forgot to look back." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the spring bubble and the wind move through the cottonwood leaves. Sarah found herself relaxing in a way that felt increasingly familiar, but still surprising. The simple pleasure of being present without having to perform or explain or justify her existence. "Can I ask you something?" Sarah said finally. David nodded. "How do you do it? Live so quietly, I mean. In the city, I was always moving, always chasing the next thing, the next achievement. But you seem so settled, like you know something the rest of us missed." David was quiet for so long that Sarah wondered if he was going to answer at all. When he finally spoke, his words came slowly, like he was choosing each one carefully. "My grandmother used to say that most people are like tumbleweeds," he said. "Always moving, never rooted, pushed around by whatever wind is blowing. But some people are like the desert plants. They put down deep roots, find the water that's hidden underground, and then they can weather any storm." "And which one are you?" "I'm trying to be the second kind," David said simply. "But it takes practice, and it helps to have a place that teaches you how to listen." "Listen to what?" "Everything. The land, the seasons, your own heart when it gets quiet enough." He gestured toward the spring, the cottonwoods, the vast landscape stretching around them. "This place has been having the same conversation for thousands of years. You just have to learn the language." Sarah felt something shift inside her chest, a recognition she couldn't quite name. "I don't think I know how to listen anymore. In the city, there was so much noise, so much urgency. I got good at reacting, at keeping up, but listening," she shook her head. "I'm not sure I ever learned how." "It's not something you learn once," David said. "It's something you practice, every day, a little bit at a time." They spent the rest of the morning working together to clear the spring, Sarah learning to match David's steady rhythm, to work without the constant chatter that usually filled her days. When they finished, the water ran clear and strong, carving its ancient path toward the creek below. "Thank you," David said as they gathered the tools. "It goes faster with help." "Thank you for letting me help," Sarah replied, and meant it. Walking back toward the petroglyphs site, David had offered to show her the correct trail. Sarah found herself stealing glances at her companion. There was something about the way he moved through the landscape, the way he noticed things, a bird call, a change in the wind, the subtle signs that spoke of weather patterns and seasonal shifts, that made her realize how much of the world she'd been missing. "David!" she said as they paused at the base of the cliff where ancient artists had carved their stories into the rock. "Yeah, when you were talking about tumbleweeds and desert plants, what do you do if you've been a tumbleweed your whole life? How do you learn to put down roots?" He turned to face her fully, those dark eyes serious and kind. "I think," he said slowly, "you start by staying still long enough to find out what you're really made of. And then you find a place, or a purpose or people, worth growing toward, standing there in the shadow of those ancient stories, with the desert stretching endlessly around them and the silence teaching her things she'd never known she needed to learn." Sarah felt something that had been clenched tight in her chest for months finally begin to loosen. Maybe she was finally ready to stop running long enough to find out what she was really made of. The first snow came early that year, dusting the high mesas with white and turning the desert into something even more austere and beautiful than before. Sarah had been at Maria's for 2 months, and the woman who'd arrived in designer heels and panic attacks felt like a stranger from another lifetime. She'd called her boss in New York 3 weeks ago to submit her resignation. The conversation had been surreal, him shouting about projects and deadlines while she stood in Maria's kitchen, watching roadrunners chase each other through the garden, feeling like she was translating between 2 different languages. "Sarah, you're having a breakdown," he'd said. "Take a few more weeks, see a therapist, but don't do anything permanent." "This isn't a breakdown," she'd replied, surprising herself with the steadiness in her voice. "This is the first clear thinking I've done in years." Now, as she walked the familiar trails in the crisp morning air, Sarah marveled at how quiet her mind had become. The constant anxiety that had plagued her for months was gone, replaced by something she was still learning to trust, a sense of rightness, of being exactly where she needed to be. She was heading back from the spring where she and David had worked together weeks before when she saw him again, this time sitting on a large boulder overlooking the valley, his horse grazing nearby. Something in his posture, a stillness that seemed different from his usual composed presence, made her approach more carefully. "Mind if I join you?" she called out when she was close enough. David looked up, and she could see something troubled in his expression. "Free country," he said, but there was none of his usual gentle humor in it. Sarah climbed up onto the boulder, leaving a respectful distance between them. Below, the valley stretched out in shades of gold and brown, the cottonwoods along the creek already bare of leaves. "Beautiful view," she said. "It is," David agreed. "Probably won't be much longer, though." "What do you mean?" David was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Got a call from a development company yesterday," he said finally. "They want to buy the ranch, all of it. Cash offer, more money than my family's seen in 3 generations. Sarah felt her stomach drop. "Are you going to sell?" "That's the question, isn't it?" David's voice carried a weariness she'd never heard before. "My dad died 2 years ago. Medical bills took most of what we had saved. Drought's been hard on the cattle, and my sister thinks I'm crazy for trying to keep this place going when I could walk away rich enough to start over anywhere. But you don't want to sell." "Want's got nothing to do with it," David said, but then he shook his head. "No, that's not true. I don't want to sell. This land, it's not just property to me. It's where my great-grandfather learned to read weather patterns from his father, where my grandmother taught me to find water in a drought year, where my family is buried." Sarah thought about her own family, scattered across the country, connected more by Christmas cards and social media than by any real understanding of each other's lives. The depth of David's connection to this place was something she was still learning to comprehend. What would happen to the land if you sold? "Resort development," David said flatly. "Golf course, spa, luxury casitas for people who want to experience authentic Southwest living for a long weekend. They'd keep some of the natural features for aesthetics, but—" he gestured toward the spring-fed creek below. "They'd need a lot of water for a golf course." The irony wasn't lost on Sarah. She'd been exactly that kind of tourist not so long ago, seeking authenticity as a consumer experience rather than a way of life. "Can I tell you something?" she said. "When I first got here, I thought the desert was empty. All this space, all this silence, it felt like nothing was happening. But these past couple months, I've started to understand that the opposite is true. There's more life here, more real connection and purpose than I ever found in Manhattan. And if you sold this place, it would be gone," David finished. "Not just for me, but for anyone who might need to learn what this place teaches." They sat in silence as the sun climbed higher, burning off the light frost that had silver-edged the sage. Sarah found herself thinking about roots again, about the difference between tumbleweeds and desert plants. She'd come here running from something, but she'd found something else entirely, a different way of being in the world, a different understanding of what mattered. "David," she said finally, "what if there was another way?" "What do you mean?" Sarah took a deep breath, hardly believing what she was about to say. What if the land could support itself without having to be destroyed? What if there was a way to share what this place teaches without turning it into a commodity? David looked at her, something shifting in his expression. You have an idea. And maybe, Sarah said, her mind racing with possibilities she'd never considered before. I've been thinking about my grandmother's stories about this place, about the old trading routes, about people like Maria who keep traditional arts alive. What if we created something here that honored all of that? Not a resort, but something real. A place where people could come to learn, to connect with the land and the culture, to understand what you understand about listening and rootedness. Cultural tourism, David said. But he didn't sound dismissive. Not tourism, Sarah corrected. Education, partnership, something that would bring in enough money to keep the ranch going, but that would also preserve what makes this place special. She turned to face him fully. I have experience with marketing, with business development, and I have some savings. Not enough to buy your land, but maybe enough to help you keep it. David was quiet for a long time, his gaze moving from Sarah to the valley below and back again. You'd do that? Invest in this place? I'd do more than that, Sarah said, the words coming from somewhere deeper than rational planning. I'd like to stay, to be part of whatever this becomes. If you'd want a partner. The word hung between them, carrying more weight than just its business meaning. David studied her face, and Sarah felt herself being seen, really seen, in a way that was both terrifying and exhilarating. You're talking about changing your whole life, he said quietly. I already have, Sarah replied. I just haven't made it official yet. Below them, a red-tailed hawk circled over the creek, riding the thermals with ancient grace. Sarah watched it soar and thought about the different kinds of flight. The frantic scrambling she'd done for years in the city, always moving but never really going anywhere, and this other kind of movement, purposeful and rooted in deep understanding of place and season and time. There's something else, David said, his voice even quieter now. Something I need to tell you. Sarah's heart jumped, but she kept her voice steady. What? These past few weeks, spending time with you out here, it's changed how I see things, how I see myself. He looked at her directly now, those dark eyes holding hers. I'm not good with words like city people are, but I need you to know that what I'm feeling for you, it's not just gratitude for the help or attraction to someone different from what I'm used to. It's more than that. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. David, I know it's complicated, he continued. You're still figuring out what you want, where you belong. And I'm not the kind of man who's going to ask you to give up everything for something uncertain. But if you're serious about staying, about building something here together, I'd like to see where this goes. Not just the business, but us. Sarah reached for his hand, feeling the calluses that spoke of years of honest work, the steadiness that had become such a refuge for her restless heart. I've never been more serious about anything in my life. When he kissed her, it was with the same quiet confidence he brought to everything else. Unhurried, intentional, real. And Sarah finally understood what her grandmother's stories had been trying to tell her about the desert. It didn't give up its treasures easily, but when it did, they were worth the waiting. 6 months later, as Sarah stood in the morning sun watching David work with a young horse, while a group of visitors from a nearby pueblo discussed traditional water management practices with Maria, she thought about the different kinds of wealth. The city had offered her money, status, the illusion of security. But the desert had given her something infinitely more valuable, the knowledge of who she really was when everything else was stripped away. Her phone, which now worked thanks to a signal booster they'd installed for the educational programs, buzzed with a text from Elena. Still can't believe my city sister is running a ranch in the middle of nowhere, but you look happy in the photos, really happy. Sarah typed back, not the middle of nowhere, the middle of everywhere that matters. In the distance, storm clouds were building over the mountains, promising the rain that would bring the desert to life in ways that visitors from greener places could never imagine. Sarah had learned to read the signs now, to trust the ancient rhythms that governed this place. She'd learned to listen. And in the listening, she'd found not just love, but home.